The crack echoed across training ground Charlie like a gunshot. Private Samantha Reed's head snapped sideways, blood spraying from her split lip, as Staff Sergeant Mason Richards' fist connected with devastating precision. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Meridian's dusty Nevada terrain as 31 recruits stood frozen, their collective breath held in stunned silence. "You think you can handle real combat, Princess?" Richards' voice cut through the desert air, each word dripping with contempt. His 6'3" frame towered over Reed's fallen-form combat boots, inches from her face, as she lay motionless on the hard-packed sand. "Stay down where you belong." What Richards didn't know, what none of them knew, was that within precisely 7 minutes, 4 full colonels would arrive at this remote training facility, and his 15-year military career would be over before lunch. Blood trickled from the corner of Reed's mouth, staining the collar of her desert camouflage uniform. She remained still for exactly 3 seconds, her slender, 5'6" frame crumpled in an undignified heap. To everyone watching, she looked like just another recruit who had bitten off more than she could chew, a woman trying to prove herself in a man's world and failing spectacularly. The morning had begun like any other at Fort Meridian, the temperature already pushing 90 degrees by 700 hours, the air dry enough to crack skin, and Delta Company assembled for its weekly combat readiness assessment. 32 recruits standing at attention, faces blank masks, hiding various degrees of exhaustion, determination, and in some cases, fear. Staff Sergeant Richards had conducted these drills for 3 years running, and his methods were legendary for their brutality. The other drill instructors called him the Hammer. Every problem looked like a nail that needed pounding into submission. His perpetually scowling face bore the scars of combat from 2 tours in Fallujah, and the 1,000-yard stare that never quite left his eyes spoke of things seen and done that most civilians would never comprehend. "That's what happens when little girls try to play soldier," Richards announced to the formation, his voice carrying across the training ground like a whip crack. "Maybe Daddy's connections got you through basic training, Reed, but out here in the real military, we separate the fighters from the pretenders." Several recruits shifted uncomfortably. Private Marcus Thompson, a farm kid from Iowa with shoulders like an ox, later described feeling physically ill as he watched the situation unfold. "We all knew something was wrong," he would testify. "Drill sergeants are supposed to be tough, but this felt different. This felt personal and cruel." Reed slowly pushed herself up from the ground, wiping blood from her mouth with the back of her hand. For the past 8 weeks of training that she had maintained perfect scores in marksmanship, tactical awareness, and physical fitness. Yet she carried herself with such unassuming modesty that even her fellow recruits barely noticed her achievements. She never boasted, never drew attention to herself, and always volunteered for the most difficult assignments without complaint. "Something wrong with your hearing, recruit." Richard stepped closer, his face inches from hers, breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. "I said stay down. This isn't a game for little girls who think they can play dress-up in Army uniforms." He grabbed her by the front of her training vest, lifting her slightly off the ground. "Your daddy might be some big shot who pulled strings to get you here, but Daddy isn't here to protect you now." Reed met Richard's glare with steady brown eyes that showed no fear, no anger, and no surprise. It was as if she had been expecting this moment, had perhaps even been preparing for it. "No, sir," she replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "My hearing is fine." There was something in her tone, a controlled calmness, that seemed oddly out of place for someone who had just been struck by a superior officer. "Then drop and give me 50 push-ups," Richards commanded, finally releasing his grip on her vest. "And while you're down there, think about whether you really belong in my army." As Reed dropped into push-up position, none of the observers noticed the small device clipped to her belt beginning to blink red. It was barely visible beneath her equipment, a tiny indicator light that had been activated the moment Richard's fist made contact with her jaw. The device was military-grade encrypted and connected to a network that monitored the vital signs and location of certain high-value personnel 24 hours a day. 3 miles away in the secure communications center of Fort Meridian's command headquarters, a priority alert flashed across multiple screens simultaneously. Technical Sergeant Linda Rodriguez, monitoring communications traffic during her routine shift, stared at her display in disbelief. The alert code was one she had never seen in her 8 years of service, a classification so high that it automatically triggered protocols reserved for only the most critical situations. "Ma'am," she called to her supervisor, Master Sergeant Patricia Holloway, her voice tight with confusion. "I'm seeing a Code 7 alert from training ground. Charlie, the system is showing this can't be right." Her hands trembled slightly as she read the information appearing on her screen. A Code 7 alert meant that someone with top-level security clearance was in immediate physical danger, the kind of clearance held by only a handful of people in the entire military structure. Master Sergeant Holloway rushed to Rodriguez's workstation, her face growing pale as she read the alert details. Without hesitation, she reached for the red phone that connected directly to the base commander's office. "Sir, we have a situation," she said the moment General Harrison answered. "We're showing a Code 7 alert from one of our training areas. According to the system, someone with Level 9 clearance is currently under physical assault." The general's response was immediate and decisive. "Lock down that training area, nobody in or out. I'm scrambling the response team now." Within 90 seconds, 4 full colonels were racing across Fort Meridian in unmarked vehicles, their destination training ground, Charlie, where a staff sergeant was about to discover that the quiet recruit he had just assaulted was someone he should never have touched. But as Samantha Reed continued her push-ups in the Nevada sand, her split lips still bleeding, her eyes remained focused on the ground, showing no hint of the storm that was racing towards Staff Sergeant Mason Richards' career. Private Samantha Reed had been assigned to Delta Company at Fort Meridian 8 weeks ago, arriving on a transport bus with 23 other recruits on a scorching Tuesday morning in August. From the moment she stepped off that bus, she had managed to accomplish something remarkable. In a military environment designed to scrutinize every detail, she had become virtually invisible. At 24 years old, Reed possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that allowed her to blend seamlessly into any formation. Her auburn hair was always regulation length, pulled back in a simple bun that never drew attention from inspecting officers. Her uniform was perpetually pressed to perfection, her boots polished to a mirror shine, and her equipment maintained with meticulous care that spoke of deep respect for military standards. Yet somehow, despite her flawless adherence to protocol, she managed to avoid standing out in any way that would invite scrutiny. The other recruits had dubbed her Ghost during their second week of training, not out of mockery, but from genuine bewilderment at her ability to excel without being noticed. Private Jennifer Walsh, her bunkmate from the beginning, later described the phenomenon. "Reed would score perfect marks on every test complete, every physical challenge, and volunteer for the hardest details, but somehow the drill instructors never seemed to really see her. It was like she had figured out how to be outstanding while remaining completely under the radar." Her background, according to the official records available to training personnel, was unremarkable to the point of being forgettable. Born in the small town of Riverside Falls, Montana, daughter of a retired park ranger and a high school librarian. Graduated from Montana State University with a degree in international relations. No prior military service, no family connections to the armed forces, no special skills or training that would distinguish her from thousands of other college graduates seeking purpose and direction through military service. Staff Sergeant Richards had initially paid no attention to Private Reed beyond ensuring she met basic training standards. In his experience, quiet recruits fell into 2 categories: those who were hiding weakness and would eventually crack under pressure, and those who were simply focused on completing their training without drama. He had assumed Reed belonged to the latter group, and appreciating that she required minimal supervision and never caused problems that would reflect poorly on his training record. During weapons training, Reed consistently scored in the top 5% of her class, but she did so without fanfare or celebration. While other recruits whooped and high-fived after hitting difficult targets, she would simply nod respectfully to the range instructor and prepare for the next drill. Her marksmanship scores were entered into the computer system without comment, just another set of numbers that met the Army's exacting standards. In tactical exercises, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of battlefield dynamics that impressed visiting instructors, but she always deflected praise by crediting her teammates or claiming she had been lucky. Captain Bradley Morrison, who oversaw advanced combat scenarios, noted in his weekly reports that Private Reed showed exceptional situational awareness and decision-making capabilities, but her humble demeanor prevented her achievements from generating the attention they might otherwise have received. Physical fitness presented no challenges for Reed. Despite her slight build and unassuming appearance, she completed every running course within the top 10% of times, performed strength exercises with textbook form, and endured endurance challenges that left larger, more obviously athletic recruits struggling to keep up. Yet she accomplished these feats with such quiet efficiency that even her remarkable consistency failed to generate lasting notice from the training cadre. What none of her fellow recruits or training instructors realized was that Private Samantha Reed's seemingly ordinary background was a carefully constructed facade maintained by security protocols that existed at classification levels far above anything found at a standard Army training facility. Her real identity was protected by safeguards so sophisticated that even her presence at Fort Meridian had been coordinated through channels that operated entirely outside normal military assignment procedures. The small device clipped to her belt, now blinking its urgent red warning, was connected to those same security protocols. It monitored not just her location and vital signs, but any indication that her carefully maintained cover might be compromised. Staff Sergeant Richards' decision to strike her during training had triggered automatic responses that were already racing toward training ground, Charlie bringing with them revelations that would transform everyone's understanding of exactly who Samantha Reed really was. Mason Richards had once been considered among the Army's finest. His journey from a troubled youth in rural Kentucky to a decorated combat veteran had been the kind of redemption story the military loved to highlight in recruitment materials, at least until the incident that changed everything. 15 years earlier, Richards had enlisted at 18, escaping a hometown with few prospects in a family life fractured by his father's alcoholism and combat-related PTSD from the old war. The military had given him structure, purpose, and for the first time in his life, a sense of belonging. He had thrived in the disciplined environment, quickly distinguishing himself in basic training and earning a spot in the prestigious Ranger School. By 23, he had completed his first combat tour in Afghanistan, with distinction, earning a Bronze Star for Valor after leading his squad through a Taliban ambush that had pinned down 3 other units. The citation noted his exceptional tactical acumen under extreme duress and unflinching courage in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. His second deployment took him to Iraq in 2003, where he served as part of a special operations task force hunting high-value targets in Fallujah. It was there during a raid on a suspected insurgent safe house that a hidden IED changed the trajectory of his military career forever. The explosion had killed 2 members of his team instantly and left Richards with shrapnel embedded in his right leg, a partially collapsed lung, and a traumatic brain injury that would plague him with migraines and mood swings for years to come. After 6 months of grueling rehabilitation at Walter Reed, he had been deemed unfit for further special operations deployments, a verdict that felt like exile from the only family that had ever truly valued him. The Army, recognizing his experience and leadership qualities, had offered him a position as a training instructor at Fort Meridian. It was meant to be an honorable continuation of service, a way to impart hard-won combat wisdom to the next generation of soldiers. But for Richards, it felt like a demotion, a daily reminder of what he had lost. Over the next decade, bitterness had gradually corroded his once exemplary professionalism. He watched waves of fresh-faced recruits cycle through his training programs, many of them lacking the natural aptitude or fierce dedication that had defined his own military journey. Each new class seemed softer than the last, at least in his increasingly jaundiced view. His particular resentment toward female recruits had developed more recently, coinciding with the Army's formal opening of combat roles to women in 2015. Richards had not openly opposed the policy career suicide in the modern military, but privately he considered it a politically motivated degradation of combat effectiveness. This perspective wasn't born from any personal negative experiences with female soldiers. In fact, he had served alongside several women whose courage and competence he had grudgingly respected. But as his own physical capabilities diminished with age and injury, as the migraines grew more frequent and the phantom pain in his scarred leg more persistent, he found himself increasingly threatened by any change to the warrior culture that had defined his identity. What his commanding officers failed to recognize was how deeply the traumatic brain injury had affected his emotional regulation. The same man who had once maintained ice-cold composure under enemy fire now struggled to control flashes of rage triggered by minor frustrations. The same leader who had earned a reputation for fair and consistent discipline now found himself fixating on perceived weakness with disproportionate intensity. Each year, his performance evaluations noted his effectiveness at producing combat-ready soldiers, but increasingly included concerns about his excessively aggressive training methods and potentially inappropriate interactions with recruits. Each warning was accompanied by mandated counseling sessions that Richards attended with minimal engagement, telling himself that civilians with psychology degrees couldn't possibly understand the realities of preparing soldiers for war. 2 months before Samantha Reed arrived at Fort Meridian, Richards had received what was effectively a final warning from Colonel James Bradford, the base's security chief. The conversation in Bradford's office had been brief but unambiguous. "Your technical competence isn't in question, Sergeant," Bradford had said, his service evident in the way he carried himself even behind a desk. "But I've got 3 separate reports of excessive force during hand-to-hand combat training and a concerning pattern in how you interact with female recruits in particular." Richards had stood at rigid attention, jaw clenched, as Bradford continued. "I'm not interested in your personal opinions about women in combat roles. The policy decisions have been made at levels far above both of us. Your job is to train every soldier to the same standard regardless of gender, race, or any other factor. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Richards had responded automatically. "This is your last chance, Sergeant. One more incident, and I'll have no choice but to recommend administrative action." That warning should have been enough to check Richards' behavior. In a rational state of mind, it would have been. But the combination of chronic pain, untreated PTSD, and traumatic brain injury had created a perfect storm of impaired judgment that would culminate in his fateful encounter with Private Samantha Reed. As Reed continued her push-ups in the Nevada sand, her expressionless face revealed nothing of what she knew about Mason Richards. Her mission brief had included extensive psychological profiles of every instructor at Fort Meridian, with particular attention to those showing signs of instability. Richards had been flagged as a high-risk subject, someone whose deteriorating emotional control made him both a potential security threat and an ideal test case for the evaluation protocols she had been sent to implement. None of this was visible on her face as she completed her 50th push-up with the same mechanical precision as the first. Rising to her feet, she stood at attention, blood still trickling from her split lip, eyes focused straight ahead. What no one in Delta Company knew, what even Staff Sergeant Richards in his rage couldn't perceive, was that Samantha Reed wasn't just evaluating Fort Meridian's security vulnerabilities. She was also the granddaughter of a man who had served in a very different type of war. William Hargrove, now 70 years old and officially retired from government service, had spent 3 decades as one of the Cold War's most effective intelligence operatives. His specialty had been penetrating Soviet military installations throughout Eastern Europe, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited in the event of open conflict. The techniques he had developed for operating undetected behind enemy lines had become the foundation for modern deep cover operations taught to a select few at classified facilities that didn't officially exist. 2 months before her assignment to Fort Meridian, Reed, whose real name was not Samantha Reed at all, had met with Hargrove in a nondescript Washington, D.C. apartment that served as one of his unofficial consulting offices. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing historical texts in multiple languages, many of them first editions. A vintage chess set sat on a side table, a game perpetually in progress against an unseen opponent. "The principles haven't changed since my day," Hargrove had told her, his weathered hands carefully adjusting pieces on a detailed floor plan of Fort Meridian. "The technology is different, the threats are different, but human nature remains constant. The most sophisticated security system in the world can be defeated by one person who stops paying attention." He had trained her personally for this assignment, drawing on techniques refined during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. How to move without being truly seen. How to excel without being remembered. How to gather intelligence while appearing to do nothing unusual at all. Project Nightingale is just the modern version of what we called Operation Onyx Shield back in '83. He had explained, referring to a legendary CIA operation that had identified dozens of Soviet double agents embedded in Western military installations. The enemies have new names, new methods, but the fundamental threat remains the same: infiltration of our most sensitive facilities by hostile actors. Reed had absorbed his lessons with the focus and discipline that had made her one of the youngest field operatives ever selected for this type of deep cover assignment. At 24, she possessed the perfect combination of exceptional skills and forgettable appearance to perform at the highest levels while remaining effectively invisible. The morning's confrontation with Richards was unfortunate, but not entirely unexpected. Her mission parameters had included explicit instructions on how to respond if her cover was threatened. The small device on her belt, now transmitting emergency signals to Fort Meridian's command center, was the fastest way to initiate extraction protocols if her true identity was at risk of exposure. As she stood at attention before Richards, blood staining her uniform, Reed maintained the outward appearance of a chastened recruit while her mind calculated the precise timeline of the response team's arrival. Every second that passed brought four colonels closer to training ground, Charlie and with them the end of Staff Sergeant Mason Richards' military career. The most dangerous moment had passed. Reed had successfully avoided responding to Richards' assault with the advanced combat techniques that would have immediately exposed her as something far more than a basic trainee. Now she simply had to maintain her cover for approximately 4 more minutes until the response team arrived. "Iddies recruit," Richards finally said, his momentary satisfaction at humiliating her already fading, replaced by a growing unease about the line he had just crossed. Somewhere in the rational corner of his mind, alarm bells were ringing. Striking a trainee was a career-ending offense under any circumstances. The fact that he had done so in front of 31 witnesses made court-martial proceedings virtually inevitable. As Reed shifted to parade rest, the first indications of the approaching storm became visible on the horizon. 4 black SUVs raising dust clouds as they raced across the desert toward training ground. Charlie, their emergency lights flashing in a pattern that immediately identified them as carrying the highest levels of military authority. The other recruits noticed them first, their eyes drawn to the unusual sight of senior officer transport vehicles approaching a routine training exercise. Richards, still facing Reed, remained unaware of what was coming until the vehicles were less than 100 yards away. When he finally turned to look, the blood drained from his face as realization dawned. In his 15 years of military service, he had never seen 4 colonels respond to any situation short of a major security breach or imminent threat to the base. The fact that they were converging on his training area could only mean one thing. Someone had reported his assault on Reed, and the response was coming at a level of authority far beyond anything he had anticipated. As the vehicle screeched to a halt at the edge of training ground, Charlie kicking up clouds of Nevada dust, Reed's expression remained neutral, betraying nothing of what she knew was about to unfold. The device on her belt had stopped blinking its emergency signal, having successfully triggered exactly the response protocol it was designed to activate. The first figure to emerge from the lead SUV was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Fort Meridian's intelligence officer. At 55, with steel-gray hair cut in a precise bob and the ramrod posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform, she projected an aura of absolute authority. Her eyes scanned the training ground with the practiced efficiency of someone assessing a tactical situation, quickly identifying Reed and Richards as the central figures in whatever had triggered the Code 7 alert. "Sergeant Voss," Mitchell's voice cut across the training ground with the kind of command presence that instantly froze every person present. "Step away from the recruit immediately and assume the position of attention." Richards turned, his face still flushed with the remnants of rage, but now showing the first stirrings of genuine fear. 4 full colonels' emergency vehicles and the kind of urgent mobilization typically reserved for national security incidents, all focused on his confrontation with a single recruit who should have been completely insignificant in the broader scope of military operations. Something was very, very wrong. The second colonel to approach was Michael Wilson, responsible for special operations coordination. His eyes lingered on Reed for several seconds, noting details that weren't immediately apparent to casual observation. Her stance, her breathing patterns, the way she held herself, despite the obvious injuries she had sustained. "Medical team to training ground." Charlie immediately. Colonel Rebecca Torres spoke into her radio, her liaison experience with classified programs evident in how she coordinated multiple response elements simultaneously. "We need trauma assessment and documentation photography. Also dispatch security personnel to establish a perimeter. Nobody enters or leaves this area without direct authorization." Colonel James Bradford, as security chief, began the process that would formally document every aspect of the incident while ensuring that sensitive information remained protected. His first priority was identifying exactly who was present in what they had witnessed, understanding that the situation had moved far beyond routine military discipline into territory that required careful management of classified implications. Private Reed stood motionless throughout the colonel's arrival, blood continuing to flow from her facial injuries, but her posture remaining alert and professionally composed. To the assembled recruits, she appeared to be maintaining the same quiet dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout 8 weeks of training. But the four colonels approaching her saw something entirely different, recognition flickering in their eyes as they processed information that connected her appearance to classified briefings and personnel files that existed far above normal military channels. Private Samantha Reed, Colonel Mitchell said, her voice carrying a tone of professional respect that seemed completely inappropriate for addressing a basic training recruit. Are you injured seriously enough to require immediate medical evacuation? The question was phrased with the kind of careful consideration typically reserved for addressing personnel of significant importance rather than standard military trainees. The other recruits exchanged bewildered glances as they witnessed their drill instructors and training cadre being systematically displaced by senior officers whose attention seemed focused entirely on the quiet soldier they had known as an unremarkable member of their formation. Staff Sergeant Richards' confusion was rapidly transforming into genuine fear as he began to comprehend that his actions had triggered responses that reached far beyond anything he had anticipated. "Sir, I was conducting routine combat training." He began, his voice showing the first tremors of someone realizing that their understanding of the situation was fundamentally flawed. This recruit was showing disrespect for authority and needed to be corrected according to standard disciplinary procedures. Colonel Wilson's response was delivered with the kind of controlled intensity that immediately silenced any further attempts at justification. "Sergeant, you will remain silent until specifically authorized to speak. You are being relieved of all training responsibilities pending a full investigation into your conduct. Military police are en route to escort you to detention pending formal charges." The mention of formal charges sent shockwaves through the assembled personnel as they began to realize that they were witnessing something far more serious than a training incident gone wrong. The arrival of four colonels, the mobilization of emergency response teams, and now the prospect of criminal charges against a staff sergeant all focused on what had appeared to be a routine combat exercise involving an unremarkable recruit. Private Rodriguez, standing in the front row of observers, found himself studying Reed's interactions with the senior officers and noticing details that hadn't been apparent during 8 weeks of shared training. The way she responded to their questions suggested familiarity with military protocol that extended far beyond basic instruction. Her posture, despite her injuries, maintained the kind of professional bearing that spoke to extensive experience with command-level interactions. Colonel Torres was conducting a quiet conversation on her secure radio, her words carefully chosen to avoid revealing classified information while coordinating with agencies whose involvement suggested implications far beyond routine military discipline. "Confirm identity verification through Blackwater protocols," she said, using terminology that none of the training personnel recognized, but which carried obvious significance for the officers present. As medical personnel arrived and began documenting Reed's injuries, Colonel Bradford initiated formal evidence collection procedures that treated the incident as a potential criminal assault rather than a training accident. The photograph statements and physical evidence being gathered would support legal proceedings that could result in court-martial charges carrying significant prison sentences. The assembled recruits watched in growing amazement as their understanding of both Private Reed and the military justice system underwent fundamental revision. The quiet soldier they had known as competent but unremarkable was receiving treatment normally reserved for personnel of considerable importance, while their drill instructor faced the prospect of career-ending consequences for actions he had assumed were within his authority. But the most significant revelation was yet to come. Colonel Mitchell approached Private Reed with the measured steps of someone who understood they were about to reveal information that would fundamentally alter everyone's perception of reality. The medical team had completed their initial assessment, confirming facial trauma consistent with deliberate assault, while documenting injuries that would support serious criminal charges against Staff Sergeant Richards. But the medical evaluation was merely procedural. The real significance of this moment lay in the classified revelation that was about to unfold. Private Reed, Colonel Mitchell began her voice carrying the formal tone reserved for addressing personnel whose true status required careful protocol management. For the record, and in the presence of witnesses, please state your full name, rank, and service identification. The request seemed routine to the assembled recruits, but the four colonels understood they were initiating a disclosure process that had been carefully planned for exactly this type of emergency situation. Reed wiped blood from her mouth with the back of her hand, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the trauma she had endured. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed to emerge from years of command experience, rather than 8 weeks of basic training. Major Catherine Reynolds, United States Army Intelligence and Security Command. Service number, classified, currently assigned to Operation Nightingale. Undercover designation, Private Samantha Reed. The silence that followed her statement was so complete that the only sounds audible across training ground Charlie were the desert wind and the distant hum of emergency vehicles. Every recruit, every training instructor, every observer present found themselves processing information that challenged their fundamental understanding of military hierarchy, classified operations, and the true nature of the person they had known as a quiet, unremarkable member of Delta Company. Private Thompson stood frozen, his jaw slack with disbelief. The words, Major Catherine Reynolds, echoed across training ground Charlie like thunder in the desert air. The revelation hit the assembled recruits with the force of an artillery strike, completely reshaping their understanding of the past 8 weeks. The quiet, unassuming Reed Reynolds had been living among them as one of their own, while secretly evaluating the entire training operation. The morning sun beat mercilessly down on Fort Meridian as the revelation hung in the air. Every recruit, every training instructor, every observer present felt the ground shift beneath their feet. The military hierarchy they had been trained to respect without question suddenly seemed less immutable, less absolute. If a major could masquerade as a private for months without detection, what other certainties might prove equally illusory? Staff Sergeant Mason Richards stood rigid with shock, his face drained of color as the full implications crashed over him. He had not merely struck a subordinate, a serious offense in itself. He had assaulted a superior officer engaged in a classified intelligence operation. The realization that his 15-year military career was not merely in jeopardy, but effectively over sent him staggering backward as though physically struck. "Secure the perimeter," Colonel Sarah Mitchell ordered, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "No communications in or out until we've contained this situation." Military police officers moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a security cordon around training ground Charlie. The desert landscape that had moments ago been merely a training site was now a classified incident zone. Colonel James Bradford approached Richards, his weathered face set in granite lines that conveyed decades of military discipline. At 62, Bradford had seen every kind of battlefield and military mishap imaginable, but the look in his eyes suggested this breach ranked among the most serious he had encountered. "Staff Sergeant Richards, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately." Bradford's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You will surrender your sidearm and credentials to these MPs and accompany them to detention pending formal charges." Richards' hand moved mechanically to his holstered M9 Beretta. The weapon he had carried with pride for 15 years now felt foreign in his grasp as he surrendered it to a stone-faced military policeman. His credentials followed the tangible symbols of his identity and authority, stripped away in seconds. "Sir, I didn't know." Richards managed his voice barely audible. "How could I have known?" Bradford's response was measured but merciless. "That is precisely the point, Sergeant. You weren't supposed to know, but your actions would have been equally unacceptable had she actually been the private she appeared to be." As Richards was led away, Colonel Rebecca Torres was already coordinating the broader security response through her secure communications channel. Perimeter established, subject secured, initiating protocol Nightshade for information containment. The specialized terminology flowed effortlessly, suggesting rehearsed preparations for exactly this type of contingency. Major Reynolds, still bleeding from her split lip, stood with perfect military bearing, her transformation from subordinate to superior officer evident in every line of her posture. The blood on her uniform no longer appeared as a mark of vulnerability, but rather as a badge of professional commitment, physical evidence of her dedication to a mission few could comprehend. Colonel Michael Wilson, the Special Operations Coordinator, approached Reynolds with the respectful deference of equals. Medical team is inbound major, full trauma assessment protocol. His gaze shifted to the device on her belt, no longer blinking but still visibly specialized equipment. Emergency beacon functioned as designed. Response time 6 minutes 42 seconds from activation. Within parameters, Reynolds responded, her voice now carrying the quiet authority of command rather than the deferential tone of a recruit. Extraction protocols can proceed according to standard timeline. The 31 remaining recruits of Delta Company watched this exchange with varying degrees of shock, confusion, and dawning realization. Private Jennifer Walsh, who had shared a bunk with Reed for 8 weeks, looked physically ill as she processed the deception. Every confidential conversation, every personal story shared during late-night talks, all had apparently been observed and potentially recorded by an intelligence officer conducting covert evaluation. Private Marcus Thompson broke the recruit's stunned silence. She's been a major this whole time, but she did everything we did. The runs, the obstacle courses, the night marches in full gear. That's what deep cover means, son, Colonel Bradford replied, his tone softening slightly as he addressed the bewildered recruits. Complete immersion without exception or special treatment. As the initial shock began to subside, the mood among the recruits shifted from confusion to something more complex. Some faces showed betrayal, others showed grudging respect, and a few displayed something approaching awe at the dedication required to maintain such a deception for 8 weeks. Medical personnel arrived and began attending to Reynolds' injuries, photographing and documenting each with forensic precision. The split lip, the bruising already forming along her jaw, the small abrasions from her fall onto the hard-packed desert sand, all were cataloged as evidence that would eventually appear in a military courtroom. Colonel Mitchell pulled Reynolds slightly aside, their conversation pitched low enough to remain private from the assembled recruits. The extraction timeline needs acceleration. Your cover is obviously compromised, and we need to assess how this affects the broader operation. Reynolds nodded fractionally. Full debrief, ready whenever you need it. 8 weeks of data fully collated and indexed. Mitchell's eyebrows raised slightly. You were scheduled for 12 weeks minimum. The primary objectives were achieved ahead of schedule, Reynolds replied. This incident merely forces an early conclusion rather than compromising the core findings. Meanwhile, Colonel Torres had gathered the training cadre, the corporals and sergeants who had supervised Delta Company alongside Richards for the past 2 months. Their faces showed varying degrees of shock and professional concern as Torres addressed them with quiet intensity. As of this moment, every aspect of what you've witnessed falls under Section 11B of the National Security Act. Disclosure of any details, even to your commanding officers, constitutes a federal felony carrying a minimum 15-year sentence. Her gaze swept across their faces, ensuring her message registered fully. You will each be debriefed individually. Until then, maintain absolute communications blackout on this incident. The butte at the edge of training ground, Charlie cast lengthening shadows as the morning sun climbed higher in the Nevada sky. The desert heat intensified, creating shimmering waves above the sand as the military precision of the response continued to unfold. Security personnel had established a second perimeter. Communications specialists were setting up portable scramblers to prevent unauthorized transmissions, and a medical evacuation helicopter was approaching from the direction of the main base. Colonel Bradford had taken charge of the recruits, ordering them into formation with the kind of authoritative voice that brooked no hesitation despite the extraordinary circumstances. What you have witnessed here is classified beyond your current security clearance. You will be debriefed individually and will sign non-disclosure agreements that remain binding for 50 years. Violation carries severe penalties under military law and the Espionage Act. The recruits stood at rigid attention, their faces showing the gravity with which they received this information. Bradford continued, his voice softening marginally. This is not a reflection on your performance or trustworthiness. Major Reynolds' assignment was classified at the highest levels precisely because it involved evaluating baseline security protocols that affect every member of this base. Private Walsh raised her hand tentatively. Bradford nodded, permitting the question. Sir, were we the subjects of the evaluation, or was it the training program itself? The question hung in the air for a moment before Bradford responded. That's a perceptive distinction, Private. The answer is both, but with emphasis on the latter. Your individual performances were noted only as data points in a broader security assessment. Walsh absorbed this, her face showing the calculation of someone reassessing 8 weeks of personal history through an entirely new lens. As the medical team finished documenting Reynolds' injuries, Colonel Mitchell directed them to prepare for transport. Full medical assessment at the secure facility, not the base hospital, she instructed. And I want continuous monitoring during transit. Reynolds' eyes met Mitchell's, a silent communication passing between them that suggested this contingency had been anticipated in their operational planning. Mitchell nodded fractionally, acknowledging whatever unspoken concern Reynolds had conveyed. The helicopter approached, its rotors chopping through the desert air with rhythmic precision. As it descended toward the improvised landing zone established by security personnel, sand swirled upward in spiraling clouds, temporarily obscuring the eastern perimeter of Training Ground Charlie. The moment of distraction was brief but significant. Among the recruits, Private Rodriguez noticed something that others missed: a subtle hand signal from Reynolds to Colonel Wilson, who responded with an equally discreet gesture. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, yet it confirmed what Rodriguez had begun to suspect: this incident, while unplanned in its specifics, had activated pre-established protocols that extended far beyond a simple assault case. As the helicopter settled onto the desert floor, its rotors still spinning at idle speed, Colonel Torres approached the recruits with a stack of documents and a team of administrative personnel. "These are interim, non-disclosure agreements," she explained, her voice raised to carry over the helicopter's engine noise. "You will sign these now. Full debriefing and permanent documentation will follow at a secure facility." The forms were distributed with military efficiency, each recruit signing with the provided pens before returning the documents to Torres's waiting assistants. The legal language was dense but unambiguous. Any disclosure of the morning's events, through any medium or to any person, regardless of security clearance, would constitute a serious federal offense. With the preliminary security measures in place, Colonel Mitchell approached the assembled recruits. Her steel-gray hair remained perfectly in place despite the helicopter's downwash, a testament to decades of military discipline extended to every aspect of her appearance. "Delta Company," she addressed them formally. "You have witnessed a classified security operation that has been ongoing for the past 8 weeks. Your training has not been compromised, quite the opposite. Major Reynolds has been evaluating the effectiveness of Fort Meridian's security protocols by testing them from within. Your training objectives and assessments remain valid and will continue under new instructional leadership, effective immediately." The recruits absorbed this information with varying degrees of acceptance. Some faces showed relief that their training accomplishments remained legitimate. Others displayed lingering suspicion about what other aspects of their military experience might similarly be manipulated for purposes beyond their knowledge. One final point. Mitchell continued, her gaze sweeping across the formation. "Major Reynolds' assessment includes evaluations of each of you not as trainees, but as security assets. Your reactions to this morning's events, your adherence to protocols during the disclosure process, and your subsequent behavior will all factor into her final report. That report could significantly impact your future assignments and advancement opportunities." She paused, allowing the implications to sink in. "Conduct yourselves accordingly." With that parting instruction, Mitchell turned and walked on toward the waiting helicopter. Reynolds, her injuries now properly bandaged, followed, flanked by Colonel Wilson and a security detail. Her gait showed none of the deference or hesitation she had displayed as Private Reed. Each step now carried the confident authority of a field-grade officer accustomed to command. Before boarding the helicopter, Reynolds paused and turned back toward the recruits she had lived alongside for 8 weeks. For a brief moment, her professional mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of genuine emotion. "Delta Company," she called, her voice carrying across the sand, despite the helicopter's ambient noise. "It has been my privilege to serve with you." The simple statement, delivered without fanfare or elaboration, carried unexpected weight. Despite the deception inherent in her assignment, despite the carefully constructed false identity, there was authentic respect in her acknowledgement of their shared experience. Several recruits straightened perceptibly at the recognition, pride temporarily overriding their sense of betrayal. As Reynolds boarded the helicopter, Private Thompson turned to Walsh. "Did any of it seem strange to you? Looking back now, I mean." Walsh considered the question, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her marksmanship was too consistent, not just good, unnaturally consistent, and she knew things about field communications that weren't in our training materials. I just assumed she'd studied ahead. She never talked about home, Rodriguez added. Everyone else complained about missing something, family, friends, even their dads. She never did. The helicopter lifted off, sand swirling beneath its rotors as it banked eastward toward the secure facility hidden somewhere in the mountains beyond Fort Meridian's main base. With Reynolds' departure, the focus shifted back to the broader implications of the morning's events. Colonel Bradford remained with the recruits while Torres coordinated the continued security response. "You'll be transported back to barracks shortly," Bradford informed them. "You are restricted to base until individual debriefings are complete. No outside communications, no discussions of this incident even among yourselves." The sun had reached its midpoint in the sky, the desert heat now punishing as it reflected off the sand. The recruits' uniforms were darkened with sweat, their faces showing the strain of standing at attention through the extraordinary circumstances of the morning. Bradford, recognizing their physical discomfort, finally called at ease. The formation relaxed marginally, though the psychological tension remained palpable. "Transport is inbound, 5 minutes." As the recruits waited, Private Thompson found himself replaying interactions with Reed over the past 8 weeks. The time she had helped him master field communications equipment, displaying knowledge well beyond what their training manuals contained. The night marches where she had demonstrated uncanny navigational skills without reference to maps or GPS. The hand-to-hand combat training where she had consistently executed textbook defensive maneuvers while never revealing the full extent of her capabilities. The clues had been there all along, visible only in retrospect through the lens of revelation. 3 miles away in Fort Meridian's secure detention facility, Staff Sergeant Mason Richards sat alone in a sparsely furnished holding cell. His uniform insignia had been removed, his bootlaces confiscated according to standard suicide prevention protocols. The magnitude of his actions was still sinking in each realization, bringing fresh waves of self-recrimination. 15 years of service, decorated combat veteran, Bronze Star recipient, and now almost certainly facing court-martial and dishonorable discharge, possibly prison time, all because he had allowed his personal demons to override his professional discipline. The cell door opened and Colonel Bradford entered. His expression was unreadable as he placed a digital recorder on the small metal table and activated it. "This is an initial statement recording for case file FMSCC 2023-117 regarding the assault on Major Catherine Reynolds by Staff Sergeant Mason Richards at Fort Meridian, Training Ground Charlie, at approximately 07:35 hours today." Bradford's voice was clinically precise, establishing the official record with military thoroughness. "Staff Sergeant Richards, you have been advised of your rights under Article 31 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Do you understand these rights?" Richards nodded dully before remembering the recording. "Yes, sir, I understand. For the record, please describe the events that led to your physical assault on the person you knew as Private Samantha Reed." Richards stared at his hands, now empty of the authority they had wielded just hours earlier. "I was conducting hand-to-hand combat training with Delta Company. Private Reed Major Reynolds was demonstrating defensive techniques." He paused, the shame evident in his voice as he continued. "She executed a counter-move that took me off balance. I became angry. I struck her in the face with my closed fist. Would you characterize this as a training accident?" Bradford's question was pointed, leaving no room for evasion. Richards closed his eyes briefly. "No, sir. It was a deliberate assault. I lost control." "Had you been counseled previously about excessive force during training exercises?" "Yes, sir, multiple times." "Had you been explicitly warned that any further incidents would result in administrative action?" "Yes, sir, by you, sir, 2 months ago." Bradford let the admission hang in the air before continuing. "Were you aware of any regulations that would authorize striking a trainee in the manner you demonstrated this morning?" "No, sir. No such regulations exist." The questioning continued for another 30 minutes, each answer further cementing the case against Richards. When Bradford finally switched off the recorder, he regarded the staff sergeant with a complex expression that mixed disappointment with something almost like pity. "Off the record," Mason Bradford said, using Richards' first name for the first time in their professional relationship, "why, you were one of our best." "What happened to you?" Richards met Bradford's gaze directly, something in the colonel's tone, allowing him a moment of painful honesty. "I don't know when it started changing, sir. After Fallujah, maybe. The headaches got worse. The nightmares, the anger would come out of nowhere. He looked down at his hands again. I should have gotten help. I know that now. Bradford nodded slowly. Yes, you should have. The resources were there. Will it make any difference in what happens next? Richards asked, already knowing the answer. To the outcome of your case, no, Bradford replied candidly. The evidence is overwhelming and the offense is serious. But to you personally, he paused. That depends entirely on what you do with whatever comes next. Bradford rose to leave. At the cell door, he turned back. For what it's worth, Richards, you're not the first good soldier to be brought down by wounds that didn't show on the outside. The Army failed you too. With that final acknowledgement, Bradford left the cell door closing with decisive finality behind him. The helicopter carrying Major Reynolds and Colonels Mitchell and Wilson landed at a secluded facility nestled in the mountains 30 miles east of Fort Meridian. Unlike the main base with its sprawling training grounds and administrative buildings, this installation appeared on no public maps. Its security perimeter featured cutting-edge surveillance technology disguised to blend with the natural landscape. As they disembarked, Reynolds was immediately escorted to a medical suite for comprehensive evaluation of her injuries. Mitchell and Wilson proceeded to a secure conference room where General Harrison awaited them along with a video screen showing a secure transmission from the Pentagon. Status report, Harrison demanded without preamble as they entered. Cover compromised, but mission objectives achieved, Mitchell replied crisply. Major Reynolds completed 8 weeks of internal security assessment before today's incident forced extraction. According to her preliminary statement, she had already identified 17 critical vulnerabilities in base security protocols. The figure on the video screen, a silver-haired civilian wearing a nondescript suit that nonetheless conveyed significant authority, leaned forward slightly. Casualties. None beyond Major Reynolds' injuries, which are minor, Wilson responded. Staff Sergeant Richards has been detained and has provided a full confession to the assault. Preliminary containment protocols are in effect for all witnesses. The civilian nodded, apparently satisfied with the immediate security measures. In the broader implications for Operation Nightingale, Mitchell exchanged a glance with General Harrison before responding. Minimal at this stage. Fort Meridian was the third installation evaluated. Combined with the data from Fort Henderson and Camp MacArthur, we now have a comprehensive assessment of security vulnerabilities across representative training facilities. The real question, Harrison interjected, is whether the pattern of vulnerabilities suggests systemic weaknesses or isolated failures. The civilian's expression remained impassive. That determination will need to wait for Major Reynolds' full debrief and analysis. When can I expect that report? Medical evaluation is underway now, Mitchell responded. Assuming no complications, initial debrief can begin within the hour. Preliminary written assessment within 48 hours, comprehensive analysis within 1 week. Make it 24 hours for the preliminary, the civilian countered. The Joint Chiefs are meeting Tuesday, and this needs to be on their agenda. Harrison nodded his agreement. We'll make it happen. The video screen went dark, leaving the 3 senior officers alone in the conference room. Harrison turned to Mitchell with a slightly raised eyebrow. 17 vulnerabilities. That's her preliminary count, Mitchell confirmed, and Catherine Reynolds isn't known for exaggeration. If anything, she understates, Wilson added. Remember her assessment of the Kehar facility last year? She identified 9 potential breach vectors. When we tested them, we found 14. Harrison's expression grew more troubled. If our training facilities are this vulnerable to internal compromise, what does that suggest about our forward operating bases, our classified research installations? The question hung unanswered as a medical officer entered with a preliminary report on Reynolds' condition. Contusion to the left mandible, laceration to the lower lip, requiring 3 sutures, minor concussion, consistent with impact trauma. No fractures or serious internal injuries detected. She's being prepped for debriefing now. Cognitive status, Mitchell asked the question, reflecting concerns beyond mere physical trauma. Alert and oriented, no memory gaps, cognitive functions testing within her established baseline parameters. The medical officer handed Mitchell a tablet with the full evaluation. She's cleared for limited duty, including debriefing, but recommended for 48 hours observation for the concussion. Mitchell reviewed the medical data before passing the tablet to Harrison. Tough woman, she commented. Most people would be considerably more affected by a full-force strike from someone Richard's size. That's why she was selected for this assignment, Harrison replied. Physical resilience matched with exceptional observational skills and perfect cover discipline. He returned the tablet to the medical officer. We'll begin debriefing in 30 minutes. Full recording protocols classified level 9. As the medical officer departed, Wilson turned to Harrison with a question that had been forming since the incident at Training Ground Charlie. Sir, what happens to the recruits? They've witnessed something far beyond their clearance level. Harrison's response was measured but resolute. They'll be monitored closely both through their remaining training cycle and into their initial deployments. Those who demonstrate appropriate discretion and stability may be flagged for potential recruitment into more sensitive assignments. Those who don't, he let the implication hang. And Richards, Mitchell asked. That's more straightforward, Harrison replied. Court-martial under Article 128 for assault and Article 90 for striking a superior officer. The classified nature of Reynolds' assignment complicates the proceedings slightly, but given his confession, we can likely avoid introducing the most sensitive aspects of the operation during the trial. In the medical suite, Major Catherine Reynolds sat on the edge of an examination table as a nurse finished applying butterfly closures to her sutured lip. Her uniform had been replaced with standard medical scrubs, the blood-stained training fatigues preserved as evidence. Despite her injuries, her posture remained perfectly composed, her eyes alert and evaluative, even as she was ostensibly the subject of examination. The setting sun cast long shadows across Fort Meridian's secure medical facility as Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Reynolds completed her third hour of debriefing. The sterile conference room, buried 2 levels below ground, in a facility that officially didn't exist, hummed with the quiet efficiency of classified operations. Digital recorders captured every word, every inflection, as Reynolds systematically dismantled 8 weeks of gathered intelligence for the assembled officers. Her split lip had been expertly sutured, the bruising along her jaw already developing the deep purple coloration that would remain for days. Yet her voice betrayed no sign of discomfort as she continued her methodical exposition of Fort Meridian's security vulnerabilities. The communications infrastructure represents the 7th critical vulnerability, she explained, gesturing to schematics displayed on the room's main screen. Standard encryptions are implemented correctly, but the physical access points remain virtually unmonitored. During week 5, I accessed the main server room using nothing more than a maintenance uniform borrowed from supply storage. No authentication was required, no log entry created. Colonel Sarah Mitchell made notations on her tablet, her expression revealing nothing as the list of security failures continued to grow. General Harrison, seated at the head of the table, steepled his fingers as he absorbed the implications of each new revelation. Continue, Major, he prompted when Reynolds paused to take a sip of water. Vulnerability 8 involves personnel screening protocols. Reynolds resumed, switching to a new slide showing statistical analyses of Fort Meridian's recruitment and assignment procedures. My falsified background survived 3 separate verification attempts, including the enhanced scrutiny triggered by my marksmanship scores. The system is designed to flag exceptional performance for additional review, but the reviews themselves follow predictable patterns easily anticipated by anyone with knowledge of military bureaucracy. As Reynolds continued her detailed deconstruction of Fort Meridian's security architecture, Private Jennifer Walsh sat alone in her barracks staring at the empty bunk that had belonged to Samantha Reed. The personal items that had accumulated over 8 weeks, the carefully maintained uniform items, the modest toiletries, the dog-eared field manuals had been removed with swift efficiency by security personnel. It was as though Reed had never existed, erased from physical reality as completely as she had been erased from official records. Walsh fingered the small notebook she had discovered tucked between the mattress and frame of Reed's bunk, the single item overlooked in the thorough sweep. Its pages contained nothing controversial or classified, merely meticulous notes on field procedures and equipment maintenance written in Reed's precise, economical handwriting. Yet Walsh couldn't bring herself to surrender it to authorities. It represented the only tangible evidence that her friendship with Reed, however built on deception, had been real. In another section of Fort Meridian, Staff Sergeant Mason Richards sat in his detention cell, awaiting formal charging under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The reality of his situation had fully penetrated his consciousness, now the shock giving way to a bleak acceptance. 15 years of service ending not in honor but in disgrace. Not from enemy action, but from his own failure to control the demons that had haunted him since Fallujah. As the day's last light faded from the narrow window of his cell, Richards made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his remaining military proceedings. Requesting paper and pen from the MP on duty, he began composing a full statement, not just about the assault on Major Reynolds, but about the gradual deterioration of his mental health that had preceded it. The nightmares, the rage episodes, the increasing difficulty distinguishing between appropriate training intensity and abusive behavior. The statement would not change the outcome of his court-martial, but it might serve as a warning for others walking the same precarious path between combat trauma and professional responsibility. Meanwhile, in the mountains east of Fort Meridian, the debriefing continued as night fell over the Nevada desert. Reynolds had moved beyond documenting vulnerabilities to presenting her recommended security enhancements, a comprehensive restructuring of protocols that would address not just the specific failures she had identified, but the systemic weaknesses that had allowed them to develop. The fundamental problem isn't technical or procedural, she explained, her voice showing the first signs of fatigue after hours of intensive debriefing. It's cultural. Fort Meridian operates with a peacetime mentality despite preparing soldiers for combat deployments. Security is treated as an administrative requirement rather than an operational imperative. General Harrison nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. We've been applying counterterrorism security models to counterintelligence threats. Precisely, sir, Reynolds confirmed. Different adversaries, different methodologies, different vulnerabilities. Colonel Rebecca Torres, whose liaison experience with classified programs made her particularly sensitive to such distinctions, leaned forward. Your recommendation, Major, complete integration of security consciousness into every aspect of training, Reynolds replied without hesitation. Not as a separate domain, but as a fundamental component of military readiness. Every instructor, every procedure, every facility design should incorporate security awareness at the same level they currently incorporate safety protocols. The implications were significant, a restructuring not just of Fort Meridian's operations, but potentially of military training philosophy across multiple installations. The cost would be substantial both financially and in institutional resistance to change. Yet the cost of inaction, as Reynolds' 8-week infiltration had demonstrated, could prove catastrophically higher. Colonel Wilson studied the comprehensive security plan Reynolds had developed. Implementation timeline, 3 phases, Reynolds replied, bringing up a new slide. Phase 1 addresses the most critical vulnerabilities within 60 days. Phase 2 restructures training protocols within 6 months. Phase 3 implements the full cultural transformation over 18 to 24 months. And the interim risk, Harrison asked, cutting to the heart of the operational concern. Reynolds met his gaze directly. Considerable, sir, particularly at installations with access to classified weapon systems or nuclear assets. The room fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled officers. If a standard training facility like Fort Meridian had 17 critical vulnerabilities identified in just 8 weeks, what might exist at more sensitive installations? The potential for catastrophic security breaches suddenly seemed not just possible but probable. We need a stopgap, Mitchell said, breaking the silence. Something immediate while the broader reforms are implemented. Reynolds nodded, having anticipated this concern. I've developed a rapid deployment assessment protocol, small teams using methodologies similar to my Fort Meridian infiltration, but accelerated and targeted specifically at high-priority installations. She brought up a new slide showing a map of key military facilities across the United States color-coded by vulnerability assessment priority. The nuclear installations glowed bright red. This approach was precisely what Operation Nightingale was designed to test, Reynolds continued. Fort Meridian was never the endpoint. It was the proving ground for methodologies we always intended to scale. The revelation hung in the air. The assault that had forced Reynolds' cover to be broken had not derailed the operation, but merely accelerated its evolution to the next phase. The security vulnerabilities had always been the true target, with Fort Meridian serving as a controlled test environment. As the debriefing session finally concluded near midnight, Reynolds was escorted to secured quarters for her mandatory 48-hour concussion observation. Though the medical precaution was standard protocol, it served the dual purpose of keeping her isolated until the security containment procedures at Fort Meridian had been fully implemented. The quarters, while technically a medical observation room, had been modified for the comfort of high-value personnel. A private bathroom, comfortable furnishings, and a secure terminal providing limited access to classified networks created an environment more reminiscent of officer housing than a medical facility. As Reynolds settled onto the edge of the bed, finally alone with her thoughts, for the first time since the morning's incident, the full weight of the day's events began to register in her carefully controlled demeanor. The physical pain of her injuries suppressed through hours of debriefing now throbbed with renewed intensity. The psychological transition from her role as Private Reed back to her authentic identity as Major Reynolds created its own form of cognitive dissonance, a mental recalibration after 8 weeks of deep cover. She found herself thinking of the recruits she had trained alongside Walsh's quiet determination, Thompson's earnest enthusiasm, Rodriguez's analytical perception. Despite the professional detachment inherent in her assignment, she had developed genuine respect for their commitment and potential. The sense of betrayal they now undoubtedly felt weighed on her more heavily than anticipated. Her reflection was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Colonel Mitchell entered carrying a secure tablet and a small medical kit. The medical officer sent these, Mitchell explained, placing the kit on the bedside table. Additional analgesics and fresh dressings for morning. Reynolds nodded her appreciation. Thank you, Colonel. Mitchell remained standing, her posture suggesting she had come for more than a simple medical delivery. The preliminary report has been transmitted to Washington. The immediate response was significant. Significant, how Reynolds asked, professional interest overriding her fatigue. Operation Nightingale is being expanded effective immediately. Your methodologies at Fort Meridian will be implemented across all primary training installations with modified protocols for forward operating bases and specialized facilities. Mitchell allowed a small smile to break through her professional reserve. Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds. The promotion, while not entirely unexpected, given the success of her mission, still came as a surprise in its timing. Reynolds blinked momentarily at a loss for words. The official paperwork will process through normal channels to maintain operational security, Mitchell continued, but General Harrison received direct authorization from the Joint Chiefs to implement immediately within classified channels. I appreciate the recognition, Reynolds replied carefully, but the vulnerabilities we've identified represent serious threats that extend beyond any individual's contribution. Mitchell's expression grew more serious. That's precisely why your promotion comes with new operational responsibilities. You're being tasked with overseeing the implementation of enhanced security protocols across all Army training facilities. Once you're medically cleared, you'll be establishing a dedicated unit specifically for internal security evaluation and enhancement. The assignment represented a significant expansion of Reynolds' operational authority, elevating her from field operative to program director. The responsibilities would be substantial, but the opportunity to systematically address the vulnerabilities she had documented was professionally irresistible. I'll need to select my own team, Reynolds said, already mentally cataloging potential candidates with the necessary skills and security clearances. Already approved, Mitchell confirmed. You'll have full selection authority within parameters established by General Harrison. Mitchell's tablet chimed with a priority notification. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting to one of guarded concern. This is unexpected, she said, studying the information. NSA Signals Intelligence just flagged something that may be relevant to our broader concerns. She handed the tablet to Reynolds. Take a look. Reynolds scanned the classified intelligence brief. NSA had intercepted communications suggesting a coordinated effort by a foreign intelligence service to probe security protocols at 3 American nuclear installations. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. They knew, Reynolds said, the realization dawning. They knew about Operation Nightingale. Mitchell nodded grimly. That's the current assessment. Someone leaked information about our security evaluation program, and they're trying to exploit the vulnerabilities before we can address them. Which means they have sources inside our security apparatus, Reynolds concluded. This isn't just about physical vulnerabilities or procedural weaknesses. We have a counterintelligence problem. It was the 7th critical revelation of the day and potentially the most dangerous. An enemy who knew they were looking for vulnerabilities could create false ones to distract from real threats or exploit legitimate weaknesses before they could be addressed. Your mission parameters just expanded, Lieutenant Colonel, Mitchell said, taking back the tablet. This is no longer just about identifying our own failures. We need to identify who's feeding information to hostile actors. Reynolds' mind was already recalibrating, shifting from a security assessment mindset to counterintelligence operations. We'll need different operational protocols, different cover identities, different insertion methodologies. Precisely why your experience at Fort Meridian is so valuable, Mitchell agreed. You've demonstrated the ability to maintain deep cover in a highly scrutinized environment. Those skills will be essential for what comes next. As Mitchell prepared to leave, she paused at the door. One more thing. There's the matter of Staff Sergeant Richards. Reynolds' expression remained neutral, though the mention of Richards' name brought a reflexive throb from her injured jaw. What about him? His court-martial is proceeding as expected, but he's made a rather unusual request. He's asked to speak with you not as part of his defense, but as what he termed a matter of personal honor. Reynolds considered this unexpected development. Protocol and personal inclination both argued against such a meeting. Yet professional curiosity about Richards' psychological state, the factors that had led a decorated combat veteran to such a catastrophic lapse in judgment, created a compelling counterargument. I'll consider it, she said finally. After medical clearance and once the immediate security protocols at Fort Meridian have been implemented. Mitchell nodded, accepting the conditional response without further comment. Rest well, Lieutenant Colonel. You've earned it. As Mitchell departed, Reynolds found herself facing the complex psychological transition that awaited her. 8 weeks as Private Reed had required sublimating her natural authority, disguising her advanced capabilities, and accepting treatment that would have been unthinkable in her actual rank. The experience had provided valuable perspective on the training environment from the recruit's viewpoint, insights that would prove invaluable in her new role, designing enhanced security protocols. Yet the human connections formed during those weeks created complications that pure operational analysis couldn't resolve. The betrayal felt by Walsh Thompson and the other recruits who had accepted her as one of their own. The institutional damage to Richards, whose career destruction had been collateral damage in a security operation he never knew existed. The training cadre whose professional competence had been evaluated and found wanting without their knowledge or consent. Each represented a human cost of Operation Nightingale necessary perhaps in the broader context of national security, but significant nonetheless in individual human terms. As Reynolds finally allowed herself to lie back on the bed, physical exhaustion temporarily overriding her analytical mind, her last thoughts before sleep claimed her, focused not on security protocols or operational vulnerabilities, but on the faces of Delta companies standing in formation that morning. Their expressions as they processed the revelation of her true identity would remain with her long after the bruises on her face had healed. 8 months later, the changes triggered by Operation Nightingale had transformed not just Fort Meridian, but military training facilities across the United States. The implementation had not been without resistance. Institutional inertia and bureaucratic territorialism had created predictable obstacles to reform. Yet the comprehensive nature of the security failures documented by Reynolds' infiltration had provided irrefutable evidence that could not be dismissed or minimized. Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Reynolds, now heading the newly established Military Security Assessment Command, had assembled a team of 27 specialized operatives trained in her methodologies. Their ongoing operations, conducted with the highest security classifications, continued to identify and address vulnerabilities across military installations worldwide. More significantly, the command had uncovered 3 separate instances of hostile intelligence penetration at critical facilities, including a concerning attempt to access systems at the Naval Submarine Base in Kings Bay, Georgia. The rapid implementation of Reynolds' enhanced security protocols had prevented what intelligence analysts later concluded would have been a catastrophic breach of nuclear weapon safeguards. The Fort Meridian incident, as it came to be known in classified circles, had become a case study in security training, though the specific details remained restricted to those with appropriate clearances. The broader lessons, however, had been integrated into standard training protocols at all levels. For Delta Company, the revelation of Reynolds' true identity had created ripple effects that extended far beyond their initial shock. The recruits who had witnessed the incident had found themselves subject to enhanced scrutiny throughout the remainder of their training, not as punishment, but as potential recruits for specialized security operations. Private Jennifer Walsh had been among the first approached. Her perceptive observations about Reed during their shared quarters had demonstrated an intuitive understanding of behavioral inconsistencies that could not be taught through standard training. 8 months after completing her basic training, Walsh received transfer orders to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, the undisclosed headquarters of Reynolds' new command. Private Marcus Thompson had followed a different path. His immediate defense of Reed during the incident, despite his confusion about her true identity, had marked him as someone with exceptional loyalty and moral courage. These qualities had brought him to the attention of Special Forces recruitment, where his combination of physical abilities and ethical clarity made him an ideal candidate for operations requiring both physical capability and sound judgment. Private Rodriguez, whose analytical mind had identified patterns in Reed's behavior that others had missed, found himself assigned to a specialized counterintelligence unit within military intelligence after completing his advanced training. His innate talent for connecting disparate information points into coherent analyses had proven invaluable in identifying the pattern of foreign intelligence penetration attempts. It was Rodriguez who had first recognized the signature methodologies of hostile actors targeting nuclear installations, establishing connections that more experienced analysts had overlooked. Staff Sergeant Mason Richards' story had taken a more complex trajectory. His court-martial had proceeded as expected, resulting in reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and dishonorable discharge. Yet the comprehensive personal statement he had submitted documenting his untreated PTSD and traumatic brain injury had triggered an unexpected response within higher military circles. While his punishment for assaulting Reynolds could not be mitigated, his documentation of the systemic failures in identifying and treating combat-related mental health issues had initiated a separate review of military medical protocols. The Richards Report, as it became known among medical staff, had led to enhanced screening procedures for combat veterans returning to training assignments. Procedures specifically designed to identify the warning signs Richards had displayed, but that had gone unaddressed until his final career-ending incident. The impact of these reforms extended far beyond what Richards could have anticipated. Within 8 months of implementation, the new screening protocols had identified 347 service members showing early signs of combat-related trauma requiring intervention soldiers who might otherwise have continued the same destructive path that had ended Richards' career. The Department of Defense had allocated an additional $15 million for specialized treatment programs based on the findings documented in Richards' statement. Richards himself would never benefit from these reforms. His military career was irrevocably ended, his combat decorations overshadowed by his dishonorable discharge. Yet in his final act of service, he had potentially saved hundreds of others from following his destructive path, a legacy he could not have anticipated when he struck Private Reed that fateful morning at Training Ground Charlie. The conversation Reynolds had finally agreed to have with Richards 3 weeks after the incident had been brief but consequential. Richards had not sought forgiveness or mitigation of his punishment. Instead, he had asked a single question: was I selected because they knew I would break? The question had struck at the heart of an ethical complexity Reynolds had been wrestling with herself. Had Richards been an unwitting subject in an experiment designed to test not just security protocols, but human breaking points? No, she had answered truthfully. You were not selected for the operation at all. Fort Meridian was chosen for structural and procedural evaluation. Your personal issues were noted as a security concern, but exploiting them was never part of the mission parameters. Richards had studied her face carefully, searching for any hint of deception. Finding none, he had nodded once. Thank you for that, ma'am. I needed to know before. He had trailed off, but the implication was clear. Before he left the military forever, he needed to know whether his destruction had been engineered or merely observed. Your statement, Reynolds had said as she rose to leave, about the PTSD, the TBI, the failure to identify the warning signs, it's making an impact. They're changing the protocols. Too late for me, Richards had replied without self-pity. Yes, Reynolds had acknowledged, but not for others. It was the closest thing to comfort either of them could offer or accept. Colonel William Hargrove, the Cold War intelligence operative who had trained Reynolds for her deep cover assignment, had watched the implementation of Operation Nightingale's findings with particular satisfaction. At 70, his official role in military intelligence had long since concluded, yet his expertise remained invaluable in an advisory capacity, particularly for operations drawing on methodologies developed during the height of Soviet counterintelligence activities. 8 months after the Fort Meridian incident, Hargrove sat across from Reynolds in her secure office at Fort Belvoir. The wall behind her desk displayed a world map marked with colored pins indicating completed ongoing and planned security assessments. The scope of the operation had expanded far beyond its original parameters, now encompassing NATO installations and key Allied facilities in addition to domestic military bases. "You've built something significant here," Hargrove observed, gesturing to the map, "more comprehensive than anything we managed during the Cold War." Reynolds, the last visible traces of Richard's assault long since healed, allowed herself a small smile of professional pride. "Different era, different tools. We're building on foundations your generation established." "Perhaps," Hargrove acknowledged, "but you've adapted those foundations to threats we never anticipated." He paused, studying her with the evaluative gaze that had identified her potential years earlier. "Any regrets about how Fort Meridian played out?" The question touched on considerations Reynolds rarely discussed, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. Professional success and operational effectiveness, Aricia, had always been her primary metrics for evaluation. Yet the human elements, the necessary deceptions, the collateral careers damaged or destroyed, remained less easily quantified. "Richards was a casualty we didn't anticipate," she admitted after a thoughtful pause. "Not his career that was his own doing, but the underlying issues that led to his breakdown should have been identified long before I arrived at Fort Meridian." "And the others, the recruits you trained alongside?" Reynolds glanced at a personnel file on her desk, Jennifer Walsh's transfer paperwork awaiting her final signature. "Some have found their way into positions where their potential can be fully realized. Others will never know how their training was evaluated, will never understand why certain doors opened or closed based on their reactions to the Reed revelation." Hargrove nodded, understanding the necessary compartmentalization that classified operations required. "The nature of our work, individual transparency sacrificed for collective security." "A calculation I've always accepted," Reynolds confirmed. "But Fort Meridian made it personal in ways previous assignments hadn't." The admission represented a rare moment of vulnerability from an officer known for her exceptional emotional control. Hargrove recognized it as a sign of growth rather than weakness, the development of a more nuanced understanding of operational impact that would serve her well in command responsibilities. "I met with General Harrison yesterday," Hargrove said, changing the subject to the operational matters that formed the official purpose of his visit. "Operation Nightingale's expansion has been approved through fiscal year 2025. Your command will be receiving additional personnel and resources to extend security assessments to specialized weapons facilities and nuclear installations." This represented a significant vote of confidence in Reynolds' methodologies and leadership, elevating her command from training assessment to critical infrastructure security. The responsibilities would be substantial, the consequences of failure potentially catastrophic. "What about the counterintelligence aspect?" Reynolds asked. "Have we identified the sources of the information leaks?" "Partially," Hargrove replied, his expression grave. "Two mid-level officers at the Pentagon have been quietly removed and are under investigation. But the pattern suggests at least one more source, likely someone with access to Joint Chiefs level communications." The implication was sobering, a potential mole at the highest levels of military leadership. It represented a threat far more serious than the physical vulnerabilities Reynolds had identified at Fort Meridian. "We're adapting some of your methodologies to address this," Hargrove continued, "creating controlled information channels with traceable unique identifiers. If the information appears in foreign intelligence communications, we'll know exactly which source it passed through." It was an approach straight from the Cold War playbook, the same techniques used to identify Soviet penetration of Western intelligence agencies during the height of East-West espionage. Techniques Hargrove himself had helped develop 4 decades earlier. "We've come full circle," Reynolds observed. "Operation Onyx Shield reborn as Operation Nightingale." "The threats change," Hargrove said with a thin smile. "The chess game continues." The conversation continued for another hour, focusing on operational details and implementation timelines. As Hargrove finally rose to leave, he paused at the door, much as Colonel Mitchell had done in Reynolds' medical quarters 8 months earlier. "One last thing," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "Private Walsh reports tomorrow." Reynolds nodded, glancing again at the transfer paperwork on her desk. "I'm aware." She still doesn't know who she'll be reporting to, Hargrove noted. How do you plan to handle that first meeting? It was a question Reynolds had considered extensively. The transition from deceptive relationship to command relationship would require careful management, establishing new boundaries while acknowledging the shared history that made Walsh particularly valuable to the command. With transparency, Reynolds replied after a moment's consideration. Not about classified operations, but about my assessment of her potential and why she's been selected. She deserves that much at least. Hargrove studied her with approval. You've learned something I didn't teach you. Sir, the human element matters as much as operational security. Find the balance between them, and you'll build a command that succeeds not just in its missions, but in developing the people who execute them. With that parting wisdom, he departed, leaving Reynolds to contemplate the leadership challenges that awaited her in this expanded role. The next morning, Lieutenant Colonel Catherine Reynolds stood at the window of her office, watching as a military transport arrived at the secure facility. Among the personnel disembarking was Jennifer Walsh, recognizable even at a distance by her distinctive posture and movement patterns. Walsh carried a single duffel bag, her face showing the mixture of anticipation and apprehension common to soldiers reporting for specialized assignments with limited information about their new duties. Reynolds watched as Walsh was processed through security, her credentials verified and temporary badge issued. Within 30 minutes, she would be escorted to this office for initial briefing, creating a reunion neither of them could have anticipated during those shared weeks in Delta Company. Turning from the window, Reynolds surveyed her office one final time, ensuring all was in order for this critical first meeting. On her desk sat a classified file containing Walsh's complete service record, including the exceptional observational skills she had demonstrated during Operation Nightingale. Beside it rested a small notebook, the same one Walsh had discovered in Reed's bunk, and kept as a personal memento, later surrendering it during her security clearance process. The notebook would serve as a bridge between their past and present relationship, an acknowledgement of the deception that had been necessary and the authentic potential Reynolds had identified in Walsh during those weeks of shared training. A knock at the door signaled Walsh's arrival. Reynolds took a deep breath, centering herself for a conversation that would establish the foundation for their future professional relationship. Enter, she called her voice carrying the quiet authority of command. The door opened to reveal Private Jennifer Walsh standing at rigid attention in her perfectly pressed uniform. For a moment, her professional military bearing held. Then her eyes widened in shocked recognition as she processed the identity of her new commanding officer. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, the escort announced formally, apparently unaware of the history between the two women. Private Walsh reporting as ordered. Reynolds nodded to the escort. Thank you, that will be all. As the door closed, leaving them alone, Reynolds gestured to the chair opposite her desk. At ease, Private Walsh. Please sit down. Walsh remained frozen for several seconds, visibly processing this unexpected development. When she finally spoke, her voice balanced military formality with barely contained emotion. Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, I wasn't informed you would be my commanding officer. That was intentional, Reynolds acknowledged. Please sit down. We have much to discuss about your new assignment. Walsh complied, her movements mechanical as she took the offered seat. Her eyes never left Reynolds' face, studying it as though searching for traces of the Private Reed she had known, or confirmation that this was indeed the same person who had shared her living quarters for 8 weeks. I believe this belongs to you, Reynolds said, sliding the notebook across the desk. You kept it after I left Fort Meridian. Walsh stared at this notebook, recognition flashing across her face. You knew I had it? Not initially, Reynolds admitted, but it was logged during your security clearance process. The fact that you kept it rather than reporting it immediately was noted in your evaluation. Walsh's expression tightened with concern. As a negative factor, quite the opposite, Reynolds replied. It demonstrated both loyalty and integrity. You preserved what you considered a personal connection while not exploiting any potential intelligence value it might have contained. She paused, allowing Walsh to absorb this unexpected affirmation. Those qualities, along with your exceptional observational skills, are precisely why you've been selected for this assignment. The tension in Walsh's posture eased slightly, professional curiosity beginning to override her personal discomfort. What exactly is this assignment, ma'am? Reynolds activated the security protocols on her office systems, initiating the formal classification briefing that would bring Walsh into the operational fold of the Military Security Assessment Command. You're about to become part of a specialized unit focused on identifying and addressing security vulnerabilities across military installations worldwide. In essence, you'll be doing what I did at Fort Meridian, infiltrating secured environments to expose weaknesses before they can be exploited by actual adversaries. Walsh absorbed this information, her expression shifting from confusion to growing interest. You want me to become you, not me, Reynolds corrected. Yourself with specialized training in deep cover operations and security vulnerability assessment. Your natural talents in this area were evident during our time in Delta Company. Few people noticed the inconsistencies in my cover identity. You did repeatedly, though you rationalized them rather than reporting them. The observation brought a flush of recognition to Walsh's face. The communications equipment, she said, recalling a specific incident. You knew protocols that weren't in our manuals. Reynolds nodded. One of several slips that only you seem to notice. That level of observational awareness can't be taught, Private. It's innate and incredibly valuable in the work we do here. For the first time since entering the office, Walsh's posture relaxed into something approaching normal. The shock of recognition was giving way to professional engagement with the opportunity being presented. Before you make any decisions, Reynolds continued, you should understand what acceptance of this assignment means. You'll undergo specialized training in deep cover operations. You'll be deployed into military installations without the knowledge of all but a few command-level personnel. Your actions may result in career consequences for others who fail the security protocols, consequences they may perceive as unfair given their lack of awareness about being tested. The ethical complexities inherent in security testing were precisely what had prompted Reynolds' earlier reflections with Hargrove. Walsh deserved full transparency about these aspects before committing to such a path. Walsh considered this soberly, like what happened with Staff Sergeant Richards. An extreme example, but yes, Reynolds acknowledged, most security failures result in administrative consequences rather than criminal charges. But the psychological impact on those who fail can be significant. They're not just losing a job, they're failing a duty they've sworn to uphold. Walsh's expression showed she was weighing these considerations carefully. Why me? She asked finally. There must be hundreds of recruits with stronger physical abilities or technical skills. Reynolds appreciated the directness of the question. Because security isn't primarily about physical barriers or technical systems. It's about people, their patterns, their assumptions, their blind spots. Your ability to see those elements, to recognize behavioral anomalies that others miss, makes you uniquely valuable in this field. She paused, then added something she rarely shared in professional contexts. I recommended you personally, Private Walsh, not just based on your file or your performance metrics, but because I saw your potential firsthand during those 8 weeks at Fort Meridian. The admission seemed to finally bridge the gap between their past and present relationship. Walsh straightened in her chair, professional determination replacing her earlier uncertainty. When do I start, ma'am? Immediately, Reynolds replied, sliding a classified folder across the desk. Your specialized training begins tomorrow at 0600. For now, review these materials, which outline the basic structure of our command and your initial training objectives. As Walsh accepted the folder, Reynolds added, one last thing, Private. Your first training assessment will test your ability to maintain cover when encountering someone who knows your true identity. Consider this conversation part of that training. Walsh nodded, understanding the implicit instruction to process her personal reactions to Reynolds' revelation while maintaining professional composure. It was the first of many balancing acts she would need to master in her new role. Dismissed, Private, Reynolds said, concluding their formal meeting. Report to Building C at 0600 tomorrow. And Walsh, she added, as the private stood to leave. Welcome to Operation Nightingale. As Walsh departed, properly signing out through security protocols, Reynolds returned to the window overlooking the secure compound. The expanded operation was taking shape precisely as planned, with carefully selected personnel like Walsh forming the core of a new approach to military security. The Fort Meridian incident, which had begun with a single punch thrown in anger, had catalyzed changes that would strengthen national security across the entire military infrastructure. That evening, as Reynolds reviewed the latest intelligence briefing on foreign attempts to penetrate nuclear facilities, her secure line chimed with an incoming call from Hargrove. We've confirmed the third source, he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Colonel James Wilson, Special Operations Coordination. Reynolds froze memories of Fort Meridian, instantly recalibrating in light of this revelation. Wilson had been among the four colonels who had responded to her emergency beacon that morning. He had been present for every aspect of Operation Nightingale's planning and implementation. Are we certain? She asked, though she already knew Hargrove would never make such an accusation without irrefutable evidence. Positive. The trap information we planted appeared in intercepted communications exactly as we designed it. There's no other possibility. How long? At least 15 years, possibly longer. Going back to his deployment in Eastern Europe during the late Cold War period, it was the final piece of the puzzle, the explanation for how foreign intelligence services had known about Operation Nightingale almost from its inception. Not a recent breach, but a long-term penetration agent who had risen to the highest levels of military security operations. We're moving on this tonight, Hargrove continued. I thought you should know immediately given your history with him. Thank you, Reynolds said, her mind already processing the operational implications. I'll need to review all assessments he had access to identify potential compromises. Already underway, Hargrove confirmed. And Catherine, he rarely used her first name, a sign of the gravity of the situation. This validates everything you've been building. If we hadn't implemented Operation Nightingale, we might never have identified him. As Reynolds ended the call, she found herself contemplating the layers of deception that had defined her career. She had pretended to be Private Reed to evaluate Fort Meridian's security. Wilson had pretended to be a loyal officer while betraying his country for decades. The difference lay not in the act of deception, but in its purpose: protection versus exploitation. The human cost remained Richard's destroyed career, the recruit's sense of betrayal, and the institutional disruption across multiple facilities. Yet the potential costs of inaction would have been immeasurably higher. Security vulnerabilities left unaddressed inevitably became security breaches, with consequences measured not in individual careers, but in national security compromises, intelligence failures, and potentially even combat casualties. Reynolds's promotion and expanded command responsibilities represented institutional recognition of this reality. Operation Nightingale had evolved from a limited security assessment into a comprehensive program reshaping military security culture across all branches of service. The foundations laid during those 8 weeks at Fort Meridian, foundations built through deception, revealed through violence, and implemented through methodical reform, would protect American military interests for decades to come. As she watched the secure facility's night shift change guards, Reynolds allowed herself a moment of professional satisfaction. The cycle was continuing the lessons of one generation, informing the training of the next, creating an unbroken chain of security consciousness that adapted to emerging threats while preserving core principles. Hargrove had taught her. She would teach Walsh. And the mission would continue, ensuring that those who sought to exploit America's military vulnerabilities would face ever more sophisticated defenses built on the paradoxical foundation of deliberate, controlled self-exposure. In the end, that was the ultimate lesson of Fort Meridian. True security came not from comfortable assumptions, but from unflinching self-examination, especially when that examination revealed uncomfortable truths.